There we go. Great. Awesome. Thanks everyone for being here tonight. My name is Nick Gayton. I kind of work with the Sabattus Pond Watershed project that we've been doing the last few months. Really appreciate everybody being here and all the coordination and background stuff that it took to get a meeting like this set up. We are going to be hosting a panel of speakers from extended community members to members of the Maine Department of Environmental Protection, talking about Sabattus Pond and the knowledge of it, the history of it, and potential next steps to try to address some of the problems in it. So again, thanks everyone for being here tonight. There will be a presentation. If everyone wouldn't mind just holding their questions and comments to the end, to the discussion portion. And if everybody could please just keep your mics muted until that time, that would be excellent. So thank you again for being here, and I'll hand it off to Addie. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. And it looks like Scott made it on, so perfect timing. And I'm going to try to share my screen. And just let me know to find you guys again quickly. All right. Can you see the, am I in presenter mode? Let me just quickly test it. Okay. Can everyone see that okay?
Muted. Yes, I can.
Good.
Yeah.
Okay, great. And I'm just pulling up. Okay. So I got all set up. Yeah, so thank you guys all. Thank you, Nick, for inviting us to join you guys tonight, and for allowing us to share essentially what we know and what we don't know, and how we can collaborate with you guys going into the future. So my name is Addie Halligan. I'm with the Maine DEP, and I'm joined by, as Nick mentioned, a few of my colleagues, and we were lucky enough to rope some of our retired colleagues, both from DEP and some of our partner organizations, into tonight's talk as they bring in a wealth of knowledge from their years working in this field. I'm going to let them all introduce themselves in just a minute, but I thought that I would just give a quick background context about those of us at DEP. We work in what's called the Department of, with DEP, we work in the Division of Environmental Assessment within the Bureau of Water Quality. So there's lots of different groups in DEP. So I like to clarify that our kind of goals and our responsibility and our work is monitoring and assessing the health of Maine's waters, and we're representing tonight our Lakes Unit and our Watershed Management Unit, as we both work in collaboration with groups like yours to assess both in-lake and watershed-wide concerns. And so we are hoping that tonight we want to kind of share with you what we kind of know of the current issues and the impacts from past issues. We know you guys have been involved with a lot of communications, especially with all the work that Nick's done and bringing you guys together. Share with you kind of what kind of funding is available, what that said funding can do. And I think one of the biggest things that I was thinking we could walk away with tonight is that that we're making a connection, because I think this is sort of our first connection with some of you guys in this first introductional meeting, and kind of getting to know what types of things we can offer and how we can work collaboratively. So, well, we are going to do our best to dive into some history and explain sort of some of our grant opportunities and sort of what we know and what we don't know. But we might not be able to cover all, all questions, but we are excited to be continuing to kind of, this is just the beginning, I think, of a lot of collaboration moving forward, because that is our goal in the group here. So I'm just going to quickly go over the agenda before I pass off introductions to my colleagues. So, so first off, everyone will get a chance to introduce themselves, who our panelists are tonight. We're going to hear then from Barry, who grew up in Sabattus Lake, but then he also spent a lot of his time or a portion of his time at DEP studying Sabattus
Very
Lake.
poor.
So we're going to get the oral history of Sabattus Lake from Barry. I'm going to then go into the Clean Water Act and our two types of grant funding. Sabattus Lake has received funding in the past. So I'm going to talk a bit about the past efforts, and I wasn't sure how knowledgeable this group was about the process and the potential for future efforts. So I'm going to touch on that as well. And then we will talk about what I keep kind of repeating is what we know, what we don't know, and maybe how we can figure out what we don't know. And my group,
Going on for years.
so
Gonna give a history of it and then what we can do going forward.
and yes, we will be going over kind of, yeah, well, what we don't know and why maybe we don't know it, because time is in a watershed with development and whatnot, things change in a watershed over time. So, and then we'll open it up to discussion. I'm hoping that kind of everything that we share at the beginning will kind of naturally lead into some kind of organic conversations as the second half of this. So I'm going to stop sharing just so that everyone can see my colleagues as they introduce themselves. Sorry, it's going to be a bit of transitioning back and forth. But I thought I'd start, since I'm in the Watershed Management Unit, I thought I'd jump over to you, Jeff, as in my group.
Yeah, I'm the unit leader of the Watershed Management Unit. I'm a biologist, and I've worked in lakes and lake watersheds since 1973, 72, actually. Never worked directly on Sabattus, but I worked with Barry, who was doing it at the time. He was the leader for Sabattus, and learned quite a bit about it then. And I've looked into some things now, and to get up to speed on the condition of the watershed now, the water quality issues, internal recycling of sediment from phosphorus from the sediments, etc. So I'll have some things to share.
Well, then I'll jump over to our lakes unit group. So Linda.
Hi, everyone. I'm Linda Bacon. I'm a limnologist and the section leader for the lake assessment section at DEP. I've been working on lakes nearly continually since 1983. Took limnology in 1980 and fell in love. Very concerned about Sabattus. There's a lot going on down there. Thank you.
Jeremy.
Hi, I'm Jeremy Deeds. I'm in the DEP. I work with Linda. She's my boss in the lake assessment section. I've been with DEP since 2014, and these days I'm usually the one that's out in the boat on Sabattus collecting samples. And so I'm out there, a few times a year usually, and I also work a lot with data assessments and analysis, things like that.
Cool. And over to Scott.
Hello, everyone. I'm Scott Williams. I'm also a limnologist, lake scientist. I've been working on Maine lakes since the early 1980s, and I have worked as a consultant, lake and watershed assessment manager, consultant. But I also, for 26 years, worked as the executive director of Lake Stewards of Maine, or what was the Volunteer Lake Monitoring Program, from 1996 until a couple of years ago. And I'm semi-retired now. I'm still doing some work on lakes throughout the state, but I have worked directly on Sabattus Lake Pond with the Sabattus Lakes Watershed Partnership a number of years ago, and then with the Dam Commission, both in the capacity of monitoring the lake, taking samples, sharing the data with the Maine DEP, and also planning and organizing and helping to implement the watershed survey grants.
Wonderful. And then last up is Barry. And Barry, I thought since you would be diving into the oral history of Sabattus Lake after your introduction, I thought you could segue right into it.
Okay, thank you, everybody. I'm retired from DEP 2 years now. I first started working for the department in 1974, working on lakes. And I was the one that developed a diagnostic study and then a lake restoration study in the late 70s and early 80s in Sabattus Lake. I grew up in Green. I've been started swimming in Sabattus Lake, or Sabattus Pond, we called it, at the north end when I first started to walk. There was a beach there at the north end. With the water levels changing, I think it's maybe different now. And I remember not being able to always see all the way to the bottom, especially when I grew to be 6 feet tall. But I don't remember that there were blooms. On the other hand, I didn't really know what a bloom was then, and so I might not have noticed. I do know that there were reports from Fish and Wildlife and even earlier of annual blooms. I also know that way back in the 60s, I think the Sabattus Lake Association either rented or purchased a weed harvester to cut the so-called weeds of the aquatic plants, which suggests to me that maybe there was not the severe algal blooms that you see now, because there wouldn't have been enough light to grow the plants. But I'm not sure about that, so I'm not sure. I certainly don't remember the blooms that I've seen lately. My uncle had a camp at on the west side at Nason's Beach area. In fact, my cousin and her husband my cousin's passed, but her husband still lives there. And so I've been there recently, fishing with him in his boat and with some other cousins of ours. So it does have a long history. And from my mind, when I first started to work at DEP in the 70s, we were involved with Maine, which came in the late 60s and had some manure management problems. And we know that there were so-called non-overflowing lagoons, which mysteriously one night, with maybe some help, overflowed down Lombard Brook into the pond. And it seems to me that maybe that was not the straw that broke the camel's back, but another load on the camel's back that maybe made things a lot worse. So from our diagnostic study, we surveyed the major tributaries coming into the lake to see how much phosphorus was coming in terms of quality. We made an estimate of the quantity by estimating what the flows were, and we developed a crude nutrient budget. And from monitoring the lake during the summer over several years, we were not able to account for the increase in phosphorus in the lake with what was coming in during that time, which gave me an idea that perhaps it was an internal load. Even though Sabattus Pond is pretty shallow and doesn't really stratify very much, maybe temporarily if there's not a lot of wind and some hot days. But we did in the report that I wrote, I think in 1987 when I finally got it done, we estimated the external load and the internal recycling load. And things have changed since then. We built a lot of manure storage pits and did some other practices on the area farm to reduce the nutrient input from the farms. A lot of the farms have gone out of business. We also had an idea of trying to reduce the phosphorus as much as possible during the height of the bloom by draining the lake as much as possible. So we did some work on the dam to rebuild the dam. We dug a channel from the dam out to deeper water so we could get a bigger drawdown. That left a lot of boaters high and dry around Labor Day because we wanted the drawdown to begin before the height of the bloom. Since we couldn't predict it, we tried to bracket the height based on historical data. And so we typically started the drawdown sometimes in the middle of August. And people were high and dry as far as getting their boats out. So we dug a channel from the boat ramp out into deeper water so people could get their boats out at least by Labor Day. And we had a water level scheme on trying to working with the Lake Association to draw the lake down early. Later on, there was a different thought, and the town, Sabattus, took control of the water level order and has, I think, perhaps changed the water level drawdown regime. I'm not really sure what happens these days, but
We tried.
the town has control of that. So I think that's enough for me for right now. I'll be around for questions if anybody has any.
All right, wonderful. Thanks, Barry. I'm going to share my screen again. Thank you. Right. All right, so I mentioned briefly earlier that I work in the Watershed Management Unit, but encompassed in the Watershed Management Unit is what is called our non-point source program. So our unit in this program is responsible for monitoring and assessing the health of, as I mentioned, the division is responsible for monitoring and assessing the health of Maine waters. And our non-point source program oversees funding that comes through Section 319 and 604B of the Clean Water Act for development and implementation of watershed management plans that are aimed to protect and restore, in this case, restore the quality of impaired surface waters. And to do so, so we encourage local planning and implementation efforts in these watersheds. And in this case, I think this is coming from, sometimes we are reaching out to folks and sometimes folks are coming to us. But either way, our goal is to work with folks on coming up with what is called a guidance, or in simple terms, a guidance document that would guide, which is usually 10-year look or 10-year horizon that lays out various implementation activities that would be phased out through what is called implementation projects over a 10-year period. In these grants, excuse me, the planning grants are, I'm reiterating, aimed at developing 10-year plans to guide restoration. These plans are a requirement to apply for implementation funds. And these grants have to have what is called EPA's, satisfy EPA's 9 element. So there are, I won't read them all, but some of the key things are identification of MPS causes and sources, and a schedule for implementation, interim measurable milestones, estimating the cost, the technical and the cost of implementation and what the financial needs would be, even including information and educational components, and in addition, the estimation of load reductions expected if said activities were implemented. And the common eligible or common project tasks that can be done through these grants include additional water quality monitoring. I want to stop there and acknowledge that I know that there's been a lot of monitoring in this watershed and a lot of assessment work. And I'm kind of reiterating what I said earlier, that kind of the more information we know and the more recent information we know, the better we can be prepared to guide and provide that guidance on restoration from here. So this can also include watershed surveys, which is essentially going out and covering the entire watershed, especially developed areas. But they can also, and we'd encourage kind of agricultural focus as well. What are the current practices? This is a means of documenting all potential erosion and therefore phosphorus inputs into the lake. This involves having a technical advisory committee. So those of us, here today, but also any other, it can hire a consultant. The grants can hire consultants or bring in, working with universities like Bates. I know you guys have, Bates has been studying the water quality recently as well. And then we encourage stakeholder engagement. You're all here today, so that's a great sign. And then it's the actual planning, writing, and adopting of the plan. And once that, and I guess this might sound very familiar to a lot of you, because the Sabattus Pond Watershed does have a plan. It was written in March of 2007. And so in order to be eligible for implementation funds, they have to, these are good for 10 years. So it would have expired in 2017, in which case that is why we'd be encouraging an update of this watershed-based plan. And once a watershed-based plan is approved, then the next phase would be implementation grants. So these are usually 2-year projects where you can implement the activities that were outlined in the watershed plan. And these are typically carried out in multiple phases. So maybe every 2 years in that 10-year time frame. So there would be multiple efforts being made during that time. And eligible tasks in this type of funding include BMP construction and design to fix erosion issues, or build a manure shed for at an agricultural site, provide technical assistance, ordinance development, conduct more of an education and outreach component, and then there's always a little bit of project administration in this type of work. And that was a very quick version of what these grants are. The request for applications comes out every year in March, and every February we host a workshop on going much deeper into the process and helping groups kind of determine what types of tasks that they need, and these are done annually. So the RFA comes out annually, and these grants are awarded on an annual basis. And one of the key things is that eligible applicants for the planning portion, so the first step, I wanted to point out is public planning agencies. And I know Sarah from Androscoggin Soil, Water, and Conservation District is on the call today. And so they are a great organization, a local organization. I think you guys have connected with them before. So while you guys would not be, as a stakeholder group, be the eligible applicant, they would be. And there's also opportunities for, well, they can be the applicant, that you can put in grant funding to hire consultants if we'll probably get into this later, but like if you need a group that could consulting group to write the plan that has expertise in that, to study the sediment chemistry better, then there's opportunities to pull in consultants as well. And funding and match for this. So this is probably going to be updated in our workshop that happens in February, but we usually anticipate about $150,000 for funding that's available, and we try to fund 2 to 4 grants, and that can range in cost. And these grants in particular require a 25% match requirement. So 75% would be covered in grant funds. And so, as kind of mentioned before there was the 2007 plan, and some of the past work that has happened in the through this funding or through our with our non-point source program. A couple of watershed surveys done in 1995 and 2000 that identified 140 sites. TMDL was completed in 2004, which included a shoreline survey, so more of that erosion issues. The watershed plan, as we saw before, was completed in 2007 and expired in 2017. But through that plan and a little bit prior, there were a few phases of implementation projects that did fix 48 erosion sites and provided landowner technical assistance visits and outreach. And then going sort of outside of grants, and that was a very fast and furious. We can dive deeper into that, but I didn't want to get too much into the weeds of grant process. But I just wanted to help you guys understand essentially that the process to update a watershed base, that there is the opportunity to update the watershed based plan. There is grant funding, and there is, support, and we can assist with helping determine those types of actions that would go into it, which kind of leads me into some historical sources and some actions that you guys some of these you folks might already sort of be aware of, but as I just said, the watershed surveys that were done, and that's focusing more on erosion issues. So in the watershed, as Barry mentioned, the egg farm and how that would be historical inputs of nutrients in the watershed that would be kind of captured in the sediments and causing some of that internal recycling concerns. Septics there was some work done in 1983 with replacing septics. And in terms of agriculture, there was help in, I apologize, I don't, if what the acronyms are, I don't know if Jeff, you recall, or others, but with help from some of the government, right?
Agricultural stabilization, and I think ASCS is the Agricultural Stabilization and Conservation Service, and that was the money end of SCS. SCS was the Soil Conservation Service. They were the technical side. They would assess what needed to be done on a farm and give technical guidance, and ASCS would provide the federal funding to support that implementation of those plans. And that's the way it was done. Things are a little different now, but you have the Natural Resource Conservation Service now. And within that, they have both the funding and the technical side of things.
Thank you for that. So again, this is outside kind of our type of funding, but other funding mechanisms. They worked on 11 farms, and I apologize, I excluded the date here, but I believe this was from like 1980 to 2000, so in that 20-year time frame. And then also sort of how we heard from Barry. Oh yeah.
I was just gonna say, I think it actually started before that, but I just want to say that when the egg farm came into being, they produced a lot of manure, and they needed to get rid of it. And farmers, generally speaking, say, I'll take all the manure you got because more is always better. Well, more isn't necessarily always better, but that was the paradigm back then. And so a huge amount of manure got spread in that watershed. And it wasn't always managed very well because basically the egg farm was producing manure all year, a lot of it, and putting it in their lagoon, and their lagoon would fill up. They had to get it out of the lagoon, and the hens were laying and doing the rest of the stuff they do all winter long. So there were a lot of challenges to basically not be spreading manure on frozen ground and be storing the manure that you were getting securely. And that's what most of this money that was spent on these 11 farms was aimed at, was manure management and exposing as little of the manure to rainfall and runoff as possible. Now, you can't, if you're going to spread manure on a field, you're not going to do that completely, but there was a huge amount of work done then. And I just want to emphasize that back then there was a huge phosphorus load coming to the lake from all this manure that got spread from the watershed.
Thank you, Jeff. And we're gonna jump over to that, to more of that in just a minute. So just the last thing, again, just going off of what Barry was mentioning, that with it regarding the dam management, there was a period of about 20 years where the flushing out the late summer phosphorus was seeing slight improvements in water quality before some of that management changed. And so why I bring this up, and I guess what I want to segue to now, is that as we kind of look at the dates of some of these things, there was a good amount of work, I think, in an understanding of what was the inputs into this watershed, and as I've mentioned before, to write a restoration plan and to move forward with restoration efforts. We encourage kind of updating this information and trying to understand all of these various aspects, kind of to the best that we can with the knowledge we have now. And so with that note, I kind of want to turn it over now to some of my colleagues, to some of the things included, handing it over to Jeff to talk about kind of what you know about agricultural information, what you've gathered recently with some of your outreach, as well as handing it over to Linda, Scott, and or Jeremy to talk about sediment, what you know of the sediment chemistry and kind of what types of collection maybe is needed to understand how in-lake restoration efforts could be guided. So I will stop sharing and start with you, Jeff.
Okay, well, I tried in the last few days to get myself a little up to speed on what the condition of agricultural activity in the watershed is now, and I have been pleasantly surprised to know that, at least from the lake's perspective, perhaps not from a farming perspective, but that there really isn't much animal agriculture going on in the watershed. And you guys live there, you probably already know this, but I wanted to understand that. And there are a couple of horse farms that probably do produce a fair amount of manure and may or may not manage it well. That's something that I think if you were doing a watershed plan, that would be a significant part of the assessment, because, horses produce a lot of phosphorus in their manure, and if we don't manage it well, it can be a pretty major source, even if it's just from a few big horse farms. So, horse is basically the same manure production as a dairy cow. So, the good thing is that there is much less phosphorus load coming off of at least that portion of the watershed, and the agriculture was by far the huge dominant load as a source of phosphorus to the lake back in probably the late 60s, 70s, and 80s, and as dairy farming has gone out of business, And, now the agriculture there is much lighter. I'm not sure if the Amish community have many animals or not. I did try to find that out, but nobody really knew. And I know there are some Amish farms that are active right now, but they tend to be a little more benign than some of our historical agricultural practices. So I think there's been a huge reduction in the external phosphorus load to the lake. And yet the lake is still pretty bad. It hasn't changed much over the 40 years that I've been, 45 years that I've been somewhat familiar with it. And that suggests that a lot of that phosphorus that came into the lake ended up in the sediments. And because there's not much aluminum, and Linda can explain this more later, in the sediments, that phosphorus can become available to get released into the water column under certain conditions and via certain mechanisms. And that seems to me to be the obvious thing that's sustaining the production of major algal blooms in the lake. It isn't being helped by the fact that we have warmer water now and algae grow much faster and better in warmer water, and we have longer growing seasons. We have longer ice out seasons. So there's more opportunity for that to happen. And those things are just going to get worse as climate change progresses. So there were challenges. I just want to say that we need to deal with everything we can in the watershed, but we aren't going to notice any of that unless we deal with the internal recycling from the bottom sediments. And there are ways you can do that we can discuss later. I think that's all that I wanted to cover right now, but if you do get into doing a watershed management plan, all of this will be looked at in detail with a lot of opportunity for input from you guys as well, because you guys know the watershed, you live in the watershed. And if we're looking, say, to do an alum treatment to deal with internal recycling in the lake, there would be a huge amount of assessment work done in order to tailor that alum treatment to exactly what is needed for this particular lake and to maximize its chance of long-term success. But doing work in the watershed is extremely important, because if you don't do that, the life expectancy of your alum treatment is going to be diminished, because you're going to have external load coming in that maybe you don't have to have coming in. So the reason to do that work, it's equally important, is to make sure your alum treatment benefits last as long as possible. And I'll pass it on to Linda, I guess.
Okay, so Jeff mentioned the sediment characteristics that promote internal recycling of phosphorus, and there are two elements that will bind with phosphorus and take it out of the water column. One is iron, and iron is very, very common in lake watersheds in the state of Maine. And then there's aluminum, and in some areas, more higher elevation areas, there's a fair amount of aluminum available that is coming off of weathering rocks. And when that aluminum hits the water column and binds with phosphorus, it ends up being a permanent bond. The difference is that when iron is bound with phosphorus in the sediment and the dissolved oxygen gets used up at the sediment water interface, then phosphorus and iron will be released into the water column. And it doesn't take much wind to incorporate both of those elements into the water column, and the phosphorus will fuel extra or lots of algal growth. The sediments are very organic because of all of the algae that has been growing in the lake for many, many years, decades at this point. So the oxygen gets used up very quickly in those sediments. If the wind is blowing constantly, you're not going to get a lot of release of phosphorus. However, when you have just slightly calm days, you get that dissolved oxygen depletion and the release of phosphorus into the water column. The alum treatments add aluminum to the system, and the aluminum permanently binds with the phosphorus and takes it basically out of circulation. Now, when you do an alum treatment, you have to make sure, as Jeff mentioned, that you've done the watershed work too, because as additional phosphorus comes into the lake and sediment and dead algae, that alum will become buried in the sediment. So it's extremely important to, if you are going down the alum treatment path, that you take care of the watershed too. Otherwise, the alum treatment is not going to work. We have gotten sediments out of that lake, and there's some ratios that we calculate to determine how susceptible a particular lake is to internal recycling, and the ratios are very favorable for internal recycling in the lake. However, that sampling was only done at the deep spot. So if somebody, or if the Lake Association decides to move in that direction, there would have to be probably 20 different sites sampled across the lake to make sure that we know exactly what those ratios are at every location, so that an alum treatment can be tailored. You don't need to add any more alum than is necessary. And by tailoring it, you end up saving money in the long run, and having less of a potential for negative impacts on the lake. Any questions?
I might add one other thing, Linda.
Yeah.
And that's that the means of getting phosphorus into the water column from the sediments in Sabattus Pond that Linda's talking about, we usually call that ephemeral internal recycling, because it only happens intermittently between wind. It happens at wind events after calm periods. It isn't a constant movement. But there's another mechanism that may be bringing, particularly early in the year, a lot of phosphorus up into the water column, and that is that some of the blue-green algae that cause the blooms, particularly what used to be called Anabina, and now it's Dilacospermum, and now they call it Dilacospermin. The colonies for those get their start on the sediment surface, and they suck up a lot of phosphorus from that sediment interface during those calm periods when the surface of the sediment gets anoxic. And they grow to pretty good colony size, and they also do what's called luxury uptake, which means they take up a lot more phosphorus than they need. And then at some point, they get to the point where they realize, okay, I could do a lot better if I was up at the surface of the water, where I could get a lot of sunlight. I got all the phosphorus I need for now, and I'm going to go up there and photosynthesize like crazy and reproduce and create a major bloom. So there's that mechanism of harvesting phosphorus from the sediment and bringing it up. I don't think that continues very much throughout the summer in Sabattus, because the bloom gets so bad that not much light can get down to the sediments, and these colonies can't grow without light. So, but I think that may be where the initial trigger comes for the initial start of the bloom. That happens on a number of other lakes, and it's likely to be going on here as well. And if you were to do an alum treatment, as long as you were treating the areas where this was occurring, you'd tie up the phosphorus so it wouldn't be available to have those colonies developing on the sediment surface.
Justin has a question. Justin?
Yeah, hi. Thank you, Nick, and thank you everybody for being here. Linda, I had a question for you. You mentioned at least 20 different sediment sites to study prior to an alum treatment. Once we identify those sites, how long would we have to collect sediments over what time frame to get quality data to be able to put that towards planning for an alum treatment of the lake?
The sediments can be collected in one day. What would happen is we would come up with a map to determine where the sediments should be collected, and it's basically based on mostly on depth and areas of the lake. So your lake's not quite oval, but it's not a real convoluted lake like some. So we'd get some sediments from like probably 8 feet of depth, and then 13 feet of depth, and then 15 at various locations. Emily Lesher from St. Joseph's College is the geochemist who has been analyzing sediment samples to determine potential for phosphorus release and ultimately figure out what dose of alum is appropriate. Usually her analyses happen either right after school ends in the spring or during the winter break. It kind of depends on her availability and student availability to work on the samples over a 3-week period of time. So the timing should be, within a month or so of her availability. If a longer period of time would elapse, the sediments would have to be put into an ultra low temperature freezer so that there's not a lot of biochemical activity happening in the sediments. We have one of those at DEP, and I've stored samples like from China Lake and some of the other lakes in that freezer while they're awaiting analysis. So that's not a big deal. Generally, my staff will go out and collect those samples. Sometimes me. It's not that difficult to do. It's time consuming. You have to drop the anchor and pull the anchor a whole bunch of times. But, on a nice day, you can get through that fairly easily. It can be miserable if it's snowing, though. On China Lake, it was snowing one day. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that does, Linda. Thank you. I'm actually shocked that you only need 1 day or 1 month time period. I was thinking you would need years of data.
No.
But I would think with most of the people in this group, we seem committed to the lake that we could work around schedules and at least in the course of a month, find enough time to get out there and collect
More hardy
samples.
crew.
Thank you.
Ask her about sorry, I'm Justin's partner. I'm going to add one question to that if I can. Thanks for. What are the negative effects of an alum treatment gone bad? You had mentioned something about that there can be negative effects, and I'm curious about that.
Well, there are going to be some short-term effects to zooplankton that happen to be right where the alum is put in, but it's a very small number of zooplankton that will suffer. There have been, I think today in a Togus Pond meeting, Ken Wagner was talking about the most recent negative effect. They had a fish kill in the year 2000 while treating a lake on the Cape, and there was some kind of equipment malfunction that happened, and they've since refined the process and they haven't had any issues since. But it does require, when the treatment is happening, that there's essentially a tender boat following along behind the barge, taking pH readings and taking alkalinity readings like once every 15 minutes to just verify that ideal application concentrations are going out into the lake. Jeff's spouse was involved with she's been involved with both treatments on Cocknowagon, but they were following the barge at one point, and all of a sudden there was a spike in pH, and they alerted the barge operator, and one of the pumps was not functioning properly. So it's very important that there is this like tender monitoring boat following the barge around when it's happening. There will be a decrease in productivity in the lake as far as the amount of algae and the total amount of zooplankton. But that's the whole point of doing the alum treatment, to knock back the algae. If you knock back the algae to enough, you should actually expect for there to be a slightly lower number of zooplankton in the community. There can also be an alteration of the types of species that are of zooplankton that are seen, that are observed. But I mean, a lot of the lakes in the state of Maine are less eutrophic than Sabattus Pond, and they have that for a natural community anyway. So it's expected, it's actually desired.
Minimal. Thank you so much for that. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Linda, I have a quick question. Can you just define zooplankton for the group?
Okay, so in the food chain in a lake, you have the primary producers, and there are subtle differences within the primary producers, and the primary producers are your algae and your aquatic plants. We're pretty much focusing on algae at this point, and then there are small invertebrate critters. Some of them, how do I explain this? Well, they feed on the zooplankton, on the phytoplankton, and then the zooplankton will be fed on by sometimes other zooplankton, but for the most part, fish that are filter feeders. And then those fish will be fed on by fish that eat fish. So zooplankton are an important component of the ecosystem. And some of them don't like to eat, or most of them don't like to eat blue greens anyway. So ultimately it will be an improvement to have fewer blue greens and more greens and other more desirable groups of algae in the lake.
Thank you. Yeah. Does an estimate of the zooplankton, like the stock, the current zooplankton stock in the pond, does that have to be, I guess, measured to determine if maybe, like, if it's particularly vulnerable? I mean, usually with atrophic ponds like Sabattus, like that is usually in a lower stock than say the phytoplankton, which is excessive in Sabattus Pond.
So alluded to by Addie earlier was work that would be done as part of coming up with a watershed management plan. Well, there's one component that would address in-lake issues, and that would include more advanced monitoring and more frequent monitoring than what's going on right now, and should include taking samples for zooplankton and phytoplankton. And those would get sent out to a taxonomist. Ken Wagner has done most of them for the most recent alum treatments. And, he'll identify what's there for algal species and blue greens and zooplankton. And then you do similar analyses after the alum treatment to see how things have shifted.
Thank you
And,
so
you know,
much.
the increased sediment, the sediment monitoring or sampling would be part of that, and more intensive phosphorus monitoring would have to be done. But we've typically, you know, my unit has trained most of the volunteers that have been collecting those samples. So if there's somebody who is absolutely committed to the project, that has a boat, that loves to be on the lake, we are happy to train people and set up a monitoring plan.
That's excellent. That was actually my next question. We certainly do have people that have talked about it, and they're willing to give their boats or their time to set something up like that. So that's excellent. And I'm sure I'll be in contact with you about establishing something like that for us. Thank you.
Dan has probably collected more data on Sabattus than anybody else.
Certainly, yeah.
Hey, Nick, also keep in mind that we actually live in Wyndham. We're right down the street from St. Joe's. So
Oh,
it's
okay.
transportation possibilities back and forth between the lake. We're only about 2 miles from St. Joe's.
Excellent.
Hey, Nick, can I ask a question?
I think Dan, I think Scott's got his hand up real quick.
Okay.
Hello, everyone. Jeff and I think Linda in particular have covered much of what I would have had to say, but I just thought I would underscore what they've said by a little bit of anecdotal information. Back in the 1980s, I was spending a lot of time monitoring a lot of lakes throughout the state. And you know, when you're doing that kind of work, you have to kind of work around the weather, because when the wind is howling and the rain is driving, it's really not, those are not the best conditions to be out in the water doing sampling. And there was a year in the mid 80s, I think it might have been 1985. We have all the data showing this information. When what I recall about that particular summer was how easy it was to get out and do the work, because it just never rained all summer. It was an extremely dry year. And what I also remember about that summer is how clear many of the lakes were that I was working on. So jump forward a decade or so when I was working with Lake Stewards of Maine, and I had the opportunity to look at, on an annual basis, data from hundreds of lakes throughout the state. And I started to have a discussion with Linda about, you know, observations that I had and that I was hearing from some of our volunteers about how it seemed that many lakes were in fact clearer during years when we had less precipitation. So Linda and I decided to explore this question a little bit more deeply, looking at the relationship between annual precipitation and lake clarity. And of course, lake clarity, as measured by using a Secchi disk, is one of the ways in which we measure lake productivity, along with phosphorus and chlorophyll. And what we determined was, it was fairly striking that a majority of lakes in any given year throughout the state were clearer during dry summers, ostensibly because there would be less stormwater runoff from the watersheds during those years, therefore less sediment and nutrients, phosphorus in particular, finding their way into the lake. And this didn't apply to all lakes, but it certainly seemed to apply to varying degrees to a majority of the lakes that we looked at, several hundred lakes on any given year. And conversely, on years where there was more precipitation, the majority of lakes were less clear. And this didn't apply to, again, every single lake, but some lakes were unchanged and some lakes were actually worse. They then, you know, were less clear on dry years and maybe clearer on wet years. But I guess one of the lakes that did not follow the pattern was Sabattus. And when I was monitoring Sabattus Lake for the Sabattus Lake Dam Commission, I noticed that the lake was actually a little bit clearer during the wetter years. And I had a conversation with Dan Garrett, who's here tonight, and many of you know Dan. He's been a long time volunteer monitor on the lake. And he had also made that observation that the lake seemed to be clearer during the wetter years. And so, you know, based on what we know about the internal dynamics that Linda and Jeff have been discussing, it does kind of make sense that even though there is certainly still some in stormwater runoff, still some phosphorus and sediment and so forth getting into the lake in stormwater runoff, there's less of it than there is being released internally from internal recycling. So runoff from the watershed actually has a somewhat of a diluting effect on all that phosphorus that's being released in the lake. And when the lake, you know, flushes the water out, we end up with slightly clearer water. So it's kind of an interesting anecdote that supports everything that's being discussed here that I thought you might find interesting.
Is it possible that because of the heavy rain, the lake water is deeper, so the sunlight can't penetrate?
I don't think so. I don't think that would be a factor. But Linda, you may have something to say, some thoughts on that.
So if the water that is running into the lake has less phosphorus in it than the water in the lake, then the lake is being flushed with cleaner water.
Right.
And when you have a lake with concentrations as high as what Sabattus has, I'm looking at the data right now, and common epilumnetic concentrations over the last, I don't know, 5 or 6 years, 48, 52, 32, 43, 55, 36. Lakes can have algal blooms when concentrations of phosphorus are as low as 12. So if you have runoff that has what we would consider high phosphorus at 25, it's still lower than the phosphorus in the lake.
Yeah, okay.
Right. And another thing that I'll just underscore is, I guess, what Jeff was saying and Linda. When I was monitoring the lake, you know, very often, even during the depth of the summer when the temperatures are pretty warm, if there was any wind at all, there would be very minimal thermal stratification in the lake. In other words, there wouldn't be much variation in temperature from the surface to close to the bottom of the lake, because it's a big, wide, open area that wind can easily cause to mix. And when that occurs, as was stated earlier, you know, the water's in contact with the atmosphere and there's a lot of agitation. So dissolved oxygen levels tend to remain fairly high. But in a relatively short period of time, when the wind is not blowing on a calm day, even relatively minimal thermal stratification, microstratification that occurs, we were able to measure an almost immediate significant drop in dissolved oxygen right down close to the bottom sediments at the deepest spot in the lake. So, you know, we know that process is taking place, that the dissolved oxygen level is low, that phosphorus gets released when that happens, and then when the wind comes up, it mixes the lake and mixes the phosphorus throughout the water column where it can be taken up by the algae. So we have lots of good data to support that these processes are occurring.
Another thing I might add to that is that in the years where you don't have a lot of storms and you don't have a lot of rain, they also tend to be often the warmest years, and sometimes the years that have the longest period between ice out and ice in. And so that kind of sets you up for a longer period of internal recycling to occur. So you could end up with it would, by having warmer water, etc. I think that's something that may be also fueling this phenomenon that we see, that in a lake like Sabattus that has internal recycling, those kind of years without a lot of rain are also conditions that are going to get probably, if anything, more internal recycling, because we'll have more calm periods that last longer. You can suck more phosphorus out of the sediment when you do have a wind event, which may not be associated with rain. It may just be a high pressure system coming through. There may be a lot more phosphorus to bring up into the water column too.
I just wanted to mention that, for example, in 2017, the phosphorus concentration in the upper waters was averaged 55 parts per billion, and a sample taken about a meter above the sediment had a phosphorus concentration of 130. So that's more than double.
Wow.
Then the wind blows, and guess what happens to that 130? Gets back up into the water column.
And that phosphorus that is released, when the bond breaks down between the iron and the phosphorus, it's highly soluble and biologically available. It can be taken up very, very quickly by the algae.
One other question that just came to mind, is there any benefit to doing an alum treatment before they drain the lake to rebuild the dam? Or is that something that should be done afterwards?
I would say afterwards, because you don't want to flush all of the alum out of the lake.
Just a thought.
When are they thinking about drawing down the lake for that?
It's already drawn down.
No, there's
For the dam repair?
For this year, it is drawn down. We're looking for a drawdown in 25 to repair the dam. We're hoping for that.
So I wouldn't want to be treating immediately before a drawdown.
No.
That might not be a great idea. But in theory, the alum is going to bind with the phosphorus and sink to the bottom. So,
but in a wind event, it would get re-suspended. And if we're in the middle of a drawdown where we resuspend, now you have current carrying the alum that you put in out.
how much of a drawdown is going to happen? I mean, is it 3 feet or is it 12 feet?
It's 4 feet every year. And for the repairs to the dam, it's going to be 8 to 9 feet.
Well, it gives you enough time to fundraise.
What's that?
I said that gives you enough time to fundraise if you didn't do it until after the dam repair.
Yeah, but we wouldn't do it before the dam repair.
Right.
I'm sure
I think
of that.
that's a very good idea, because you would be having an artificial flushing of the lake when you draw it down.
Yeah.
It would be removing probably half the volume of the lake, be my guess, or maybe even more than that. It might be 2/3. And that would be that would be a flushing rate that is totally unnatural for the lake. The lake normally only flushes like 1.5 times per year. But you would be in a relatively short period of time pushing a lot of that water out, and yeah, you could be removing a lot of the alum during wind mixing events. So I think it would be very wise to wait until afterwards.
Yeah, and it's going to take at least 2 months to draw that water out. So any wind events in that time could potentially resuspend the alum and send it down the river.
Another factor to consider is that by lowering the water level during the time when the dam is being repaired, you're ostensibly purging a lot of phosphorus from the lake. And that's, phosphorus that less phosphorus when the lake refills. That what am I trying to say here? The alum would go further in terms of dealing with binding phosphorus if there was less phosphorus in the lake because it had been purged when the water level was lowered.
Yeah, maybe. But then when you rehydrate all of that soil, that releases phosphorus on it by itself. So, I don't know if spending $1.5 million on a alum treatment and then flushing all the alum out of the lake, or a majority of it, would be really cost effective or work very good. Say you send half of the alum out. Well, that will cut down on the life of the alum treatment.
I don't think that was what Scott was suggesting. I think he was suggesting that you would have, if you did do the drawdown before the alum, and you would get phosphorus out of the system, that would make the alum treatment even more effective.
Oh,
Right.
okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's what I was attempting.
Backwards.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah, do the drawdown, then the treatment.
Yes.
Okay.
And
I've got a question. The DMR stocks our lake with alewives every year. Alewives like to eat zooplankton, and zooplankton likes to eat algae. So is it wise to put plankton feeders introduce them to the lake?
There's a lot of potential complications with alewives. Right now, you have a very low stocking rate. So you grow, because there's only a limited amount of adults coming in and spawning. You have a less egg laying going on, less juveniles than you might otherwise have. But the population that you have a huge smorgasbord of food to eat because the lake is so productive. And so you guys have the alewives that come out of Sabattus Pond, right? The juveniles that come out of Sabattus Pond right now are the biggest ones in the state.
They were the biggest ones I've seen ever when they left this year.
I don't doubt it. And it's so, if, for instance, there was a decision to put a fish ladder in and to let a lot more alewives into the lake, that things would change to a degree at least, and you'd end up having a lot more egg laying, a lot more little juveniles competing for the available zooplankton supply. And the juveniles going downstream would be smaller. They'd probably still be pretty good size, but just because there's so much to eat in that lake. there
Well,
are
this-
some other things to consider too, and uh, they can affect the food chain by chomping down on selectively harvesting certain portions of the zooplankton community. But what that does to apparent lake water quality is really much harder to define. In other words, if you're looking at the lake, does it get greener, or is it, it's really hard to define. The other potential is that the adult alewives that come into the lake grow up out in the ocean, okay? And then they come in to spawn. And if all of them go back out before they die, then you don't have any net input to the lake of phosphorus when they die. See, they'll bring phosphorus from the ocean into the lake. And if they go back out, they'll take it out with them again. But if they die in the lake, they'll leave that phosphorus behind. On the other hand, the juveniles that grow up in the lake, they eat things in the lake. They turn into a little phosphorus carriers that take lake phosphorus downstream. So there's a balance here of whether you have a net input or a net release of phosphorus if you're going to have a significant alewife run. Right now, you have so few juveniles being stocked in the lake that it doesn't make any difference if all of them die. If you had an uncontrolled run, you might have a net input of phosphorus as a result of the alewives. If you had a strategically controlled run that everybody was committed to, you might even be able to export nutrients out with the juveniles, more nutrients than the adults brought in and left behind. So, but that is a balance that if you were going to consider, or anybody was going to consider a bigger run into the lake, a non-stocked run, but free access situation, you'd really want to look closely at how that was going to be managed.
Well, we're not looking at a free run. They are discussing a fish ladder, but we have already told them, the dam commission's already said the limit is 10,000 adults a year, which is what they're stocking now.
Okay.
I'd like to add my 2 cents worth, since I'm the one that started this whole controversy on Sabattus Pond back in 1985. This is Barry Moore speaking.
Yeah.
So in a simple food chain, what you think of is correct. Zooplankton eat algae. Alewives eat zooplankton. So if you had a lot of alewives, eat the zooplankton and you should have more algae. That's a simple food chain, but it's not simple. And it's not a simple food chain, it's a food web. It's much more complicated than that. And some zooplankton eat other zooplankton. So which zooplankton do they eat? Do they eat the ones that eat blue greens or not? And as somebody already said today, a lot of zooplankton don't like blue greens. So it's really more complex than a simple food chain. And we've looked at a lot of lakes around Maine that have natural runs of alewives and have not seen, and Linda or Jeff can correct me, but the study that I did before I left, I did not see any negative effect on water quality from lakes that had natural runs of alewives. So it's just more complicated than that. So don't necessarily think that you're going to have a problem.
Well, Barry, I remember 1985. I remember how bad the lake was in 85. And I do remember I was here. It was so bad that legislation was introduced by Albert Stevens to, you had to get permission from all surrounding towns to stock a lake. Now, that legislation was taken away because Louis Flagg was the head of DMR at the time. He made an agreement with Albert that said there will be no alewives stocked in the lake. From 85 to 2001, where the DMR came to us and we agreed to let them put alewives in at a limited number.
Yeah, and also 85 was also a very different weather year. So there are many factors that it may have been that. And at that Sabattus Lake meeting in 85, I told you folks, and I've learned more since, and I still don't know the whole answer. But I told you folks that it might have a short-term negative impact, but a long-term positive impact, like Jeff just mentioned. And so I still go back to looking at all the natural lakes that I looked at that have natural runs of alewives, unlimited amounts, that we just don't see the negative impacts that you might expect if it was that simple. It just really isn't.
Well, I understand it's not simple. Everything's complicated, but I think a unregulated migration up a fish ladder would be a bad thing.
I don't mean to cut anybody off or jump in. We are 30 minutes over time. I love the conversation that's happening. This is certainly not going to be the end of this. This is just the beginning and establishment of this relationship. Like I said, appreciate everything that everybody was talking about. I'm just going to hand it off to Addie real quick to do a quick summary, and then we'll go from there. If anybody has any additional questions immediately that they didn't get a chance to talk about, please send me an email or and I can forward them off to the panel, and they can try to address them after the fact too. And like I said, this is certainly not going to be the end of this type of thing. So thank you very much.
Nick, I have just one question. Is the of the lake like they want to do, is it limited to, like, I don't come home back to Maine until the end of May? Is it sampling done year through the whole summer, or is it just limited to spring and fall? Or that's just because I want to be part of that testing, but I just want to make sure that I'm not there too late. You know what I mean?
What sampling are you asking about?
Well, they just said that, you know, to go around, take people out in their boats so they can sample the lake in more areas.
Yeah, I think Linda.
Okay,
might have...
that's for the soil samples.
The
Yeah.
sediment sampling could happen anytime. It's better to do it in the spring if possible, but it could happen anytime in basically one day, one decent day on the lake. The augmented monitoring should happen every 2 weeks from ice out until late October, November.
But I just want to make sure I'm available to be part of that is all I'm saying. But I don't get home in Maine until the end of May. So I'm very much interested in helping out there.
You somewhere nice and warm, Wayne?
I am right, sir.
It's cold here.
And I'll take Wayne's question to just kind of wrap up, because if you guys, so I think to summarize sort of what we talked about today, there's a lot of complexities to this, and we are our mission and our goals are to be closely involved in these discussions and to help aid restoration efforts, and we see that there's the importance to both in-lake and watershed-wide work. And if you kind of want to go the direction of pursuing a 604B grant, one aspect of it is match, and part of that is in-kind match. So that includes kind of volunteer labor. So it's really great to hear. I know all the enthusiasm tonight, and Wayne wanting to be sure to be there for monitoring. And so I guess I just wanted to end by saying that Yeah, we'd love to continue these conversations. I think helping kind of come up with some tasks like that can be funded through the grant, which would be advantageous, I think. And that our group, the Watershed Management Unit and the Lakes Unit, have the ability to provide technical support both kind of before the grant and during the grant process, from what Linda's mentioned, like collecting the sediment samples, and we help guide watershed survey work. So we are certainly here to support, and are kind of looking forward to continuing these conversations with you guys.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
all.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks to all of you for being here.
Yeah,
Thanks,
thank you
John.
all for speaking with us tonight. And so I'm gonna conclude this. Like I said, great conversations. Appreciate everybody from the panel coming in tonight and spending time. Everybody who was here watching, and everybody who was watching after the fact on our YouTube page. So again, thanks everybody, and I hope everybody has a great night. Again, reach out with any questions that you want answered, and we can go from there. We probably will not have a meeting next week just because it's Thanksgiving, but I will send out an email on our email list to everybody as well. So
This meeting will be available to watch, Nick.
yes, honestly, in about like 35 minutes after when I upload it tonight. So I will send out an email for that. I'll throw it on our social media pages, and I'll be in touch with you all probably early next week about when our next meeting is. So
Thank you all so much.
thank you, everybody. Have a
Thanksgiving,
great
everyone.
night.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Guys.
Thanks, Nick.
All right.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Nick.